Hello there, and welcome to the Daily Dose of Lore. Tonight, we're exploring 8,000 years of House Stark history, from the legendary Brandon the Builder, who raised Winterfell from stone and ice, through the great warrior kings who defended the north against all enemies, to the sons and daughters whose fates would shake the foundations of Westeros itself. Some stories carry triumph, others carry sorrow that echoes through centuries, but all of them have shaped the family whose words remind us that winter is coming. If this helped you unwind, tapping, like, and subscribing would mean the world to me, and it helps more people find a calm place to rest, too. But for now, let us begin. The story of House Stark begins in an age so distant that history blurs into legend, when the first men still walked beneath trees that had never known an axe, and the children of the forest sang their songs in groves now long forgotten. It was in this ancient time that Brandon Stark, who would come to be known as Brandon the Builder, first appeared in the Chronicles of Westeros. The tales say he was a figure of almost impossible accomplishment, a man whose works would define the North for 8,000 years to come. He built Winterfell, raising its gray granite walls and digging the hot springs that would warm the castle through the longest winters. He constructed the Wall, that massive barrier of ice and ancient magic that stretches for 300 miles across the northern border of the realm. Some stories even credit him with building Storm's End in the Stormlands, its walls enchanted to withstand any storm. Whether one man could truly accomplish all these feats remains a mystery lost to time. But what is certain is that Brandon the Builder founded House Stark and established their seat at Winterfell, beginning a dynasty that would rule the North as Kings of Winter for thousands of years. The construction of Winterfell itself speaks to the genius of its creator. For Brandon, the Builder did not simply raise walls against the cold, but worked with the very earth to create warmth in a land of eternal winter. Beneath the castle, hot springs bubble up from deep within the ground, and Brandon channeled this water through the walls themselves, creating a castle that breathes with gentle heat even when snows pile high against its gates. The oldest parts of Winterfell, the first keep and the crypts beneath, date back to Brandon's own time. Their stones fitted together with a precision that modern builders struggle to replicate. The crypts stretch deep into the earth, a vast underground city of the dead, where generations of Starks rest in eternal darkness. Each lord and king lies with a stone direwolf at his feet and an iron sword across his lap, the sword meant to keep vengeful spirits within their tombs. Over millennia, these crypts have grown so extensive that their deepest reaches remain unexplored, holding secrets and perhaps even Starks whose names have been lost to history. Brandon the Builder's greatest work, however, may be the wall itself, that towering barrier of ice that stands 700 feet tall and stretches from the gorge to the Bay of Seals. According to the oldest legends, Brandon raised the wall with the help of giants, who carried massive blocks of ice into place while magic woven by the children of the forest bound the structure together and imbued it with spells to repel the darkness beyond. The wall was not simply a physical barrier, but a magical one, designed to protect the realms of men from the others and the creatures that served them. Brandon established the Night's Watch to man this wall, an order that would endure for 8,000 years, though by the time of recent events their numbers had dwindled and their true purpose had been nearly forgotten. The wall remains one of the wonders of the known world, a testament to what was possible in an age when men and magic worked together against a common enemy that has since faded into myth and nightmare. Following Brandon the Builder, the Starks ruled as Kings of Winter for approximately 8,000 years, making them the longest continuous dynasty in the known history of Westeros. During this vast stretch of time, they transformed from a single family in a single castle into the paramount rulers of the entire North, a territory larger than the other 6 kingdoms combined. This expansion did not come peacefully. The Starks conquered or absorbed dozens of other noble houses, from the Blackwoods who ruled the Wolfswood to the Wargs and the Greenwoods, and the ancient Marsh Kings who held the Neck. Each conquest added to Stark power, but also wove those bloodlines into the Stark lineage, creating a family that carried the blood of first men from across the North. The process took thousands of years, a slow gathering of power punctuated by wars, marriages, and sometimes the complete extinction of rival houses. By the time the Andals invaded Westeros, the Starks had already unified the North under their rule, creating a kingdom that would prove strong enough to resist where the southern kingdoms fell. The title, King of Winter itself, carries a weight and grimness that sets the Starks apart from other ancient dynasties. While southern kings styled themselves with flowing titles and grand names, the Starks chose a title that spoke of the harshness they ruled and the harshness they embodied. Winter was not something to be feared and avoided, but something to be embraced and wielded. The Kings of Winter wore crowns of bronze, later iron, set with runes of the first men, and topped with 9 longsword points, a martial crown for a martial people. They sat upon thrones in the great hall of Winterfell, dispensing justice with swords their servants had dubbed ice, a name passed from blade to blade across the millennia until it rested finally with the Valyrian steel greatsword that Eddard Stark would one day wield. The Kings of Winter ruled with severity, and their enemies knew that to march against Winterfell was to march against winter itself. Among the most renowned of the early Stark kings was Theon Stark, known as the Hungry Wolf, who lived during the coming of the Andals to Westeros. While other kingdoms fell before the Andal invasion, their first men kings overthrown, and their sacred weirwood trees burned, the North stood firm. Theon Stark met the Andals on the eastern shore and defeated an alliance of Andal warlords in a battle so decisive that no Andal army would threaten the North again. But Theon was not content with mere defense. He loaded his fallen enemies' bodies onto ships and sailed across the narrow sea, where he attacked the Andal coastline and left the heads mounted on spikes along the shore as a warning. The message was clear. The North remembers, and the North does not forgive. To this day, the North remains the only region of Westeros where the blood of the first men runs purest, and where the old gods are still worshipped in sacred groves. This is the legacy of the Hungry Wolf, who ensured that what Brandon the Builder created would not fall to foreign invaders. Theon Stark's victories extended beyond the Andals. During his long reign, he also defeated a king beyond the Wall, who had led a host of wildlings south, pushed the Ironborn out of the western shore where they had established holdings, and won a war against the Boltons that brought that ancient family to heel. The Boltons had been the Starks' most persistent rivals in the North, Red Kings who ruled from the Dreadfort and practiced the gruesome custom of flaying their enemies alive. For 1,000 years, Stark and Bolton had fought, and the Dreadfort's walls were said to be decorated with the skins of Stark princes. Theon Stark ended this ancient enmity, forcing the Boltons to bend the knee and swear fealty to Winterfell. They would remain Stark bannermen for thousands of years afterward, though the old hatred never truly died, smoldering like embers beneath snow, waiting for the moment to blaze again. The Starks also waged wars against the kings of the Night's Watch, who in the earliest days were not servants of the realm, but petty kings in their own right, ruling the gift and answering to no one. One king of winter, whose name has been lost, rode north with his army and threw down the Night's King, a 13th Lord Commander, who had taken a pale bride and declared himself ruler of the Wall. Together with Joramun, a king beyond the Wall, this Stark destroyed the Night's King and ended his dark reign. Afterward, all records of the Night's King were destroyed, his very name forbidden to be spoken. Some tales whisper that the Night's King was himself a Stark, a brother of the King of Winter who had found something terrible in the frozen lands beyond the Wall. If true, this would make the Starks' defeat of him both a victory and a tragedy, a family destroying one of its own to save the realm from whatever horror he had become. One of the more melancholy tales from the Age of Heroes concerns Brandon the Shipwright, a king of winter who became obsessed with the sea despite ruling a landlocked kingdom. The north has little coastline suitable for harbors, and the Ironborn had long dominated the western waters, but Brandon dreamed of building a fleet that could rival any in the world. He ordered the construction of ships and sailed them from the eastern shore, exploring up and down the coast and venturing further out to sea than any northern king before him. His great ambition was to discover what lay across the Sunset Sea, the vast ocean west of Westeros that no ship had ever crossed and returned to tell of. One day, Brandon the Shipwright set sail into those western waters with his entire fleet, hoping to find new lands beyond the horizon. He was never seen again. His ships vanished without a trace, swallowed by the unknown waters, and neither he nor any of his crew ever returned. His fate remains one of the great mysteries of Stark history. The loss of Brandon the Shipwright affected his son so deeply that it changed the course of Northern history. This son, who became known as Brandon the Burner, inherited his father's throne, and with it his grief and rage. Unable to accept that his father had simply vanished, yet equally unable to find him or avenge him, Brandon the Burner turned his anguish upon the instruments of his father's disappearance. He ordered every ship in the north set ablaze, watching from the shore as the entire northern fleet burned to ashes on the water. He then closed the shipyards and forbade the construction of warships. From that day forward, the North would have no fleet to speak of, relying instead on the ships of White Harbor and leaving the seas to others. This act of grief would have consequences for thousands of years, leaving the North vulnerable to attack from the sea and unable to project power beyond its coasts. All because one king could not bear the reminder of his lost father. The Starks faced other challenges from beyond their borders, including centuries of conflict with the Ironborn who raided the western coasts and at times held the territory on the mainland. Bear Island, which would eventually become the seat of House Mormont, was originally held by the Ironborn until a king of winter won it back and awarded it to his loyal vassals. The fight against the Ironborn was a constant struggle, where the Sea Raiders would attack, be pushed back, then return again a generation later. Roderick Stark finally ended the Ironborn threat by defeating Ravos the Raper, the last Ironborn king to hold the western shore, and driving the raiders back to their islands permanently. It was Roderick who awarded Bear Island to the Mormonts, though legends differ on exactly how this happened. Some say he won it in a wrestling match, others that he gave it as reward for valor. Whatever the truth, the western shore was finally secured for the North. The long night that terrible winter that lasted a generation and brought the others down from the far north, tested House Stark as nothing before or since. According to legend, it was during this endless darkness that the last hero ventured into the frozen wastes to seek the children of the forest and learn how to defeat the others. Some tales name this last hero as a Stark, a desperate king who walked into the night with his companions and his dog, watching each of them die one by one until he stood alone against the cold. Whether he found the children and what he learned from them remains unclear, but somehow the others were driven back, and the long night ended. The wall was either raised or reinforced in the aftermath, and the Night's Watch began its eternal vigil. The Starks had survived the greatest catastrophe in the history of the world, and they emerged from the long night with their power intact and their words more relevant than ever. Winter is coming. The marriage practices of the Starks often served political purposes, binding other northern houses to Winterfell through blood. The Starks wed daughters of the Blackwoods and the Royces, of the Flints and the Karstarks, of the Manderleys and the Glovers. These marriages brought new blood into the Stark line and ensured the loyalty of vassal houses, for a lord who has Stark blood in his veins is less likely to rebel against his cousins in Winterfell. The Karstarks themselves are an offshoot of the Starks, their name deriving from Karlon Stark, a younger son who was granted lands for putting down a rebellion centuries ago, and whose descendants eventually became their own house. The Grey Starks were another cadet branch who held the Wolf's Den, but they joined the Boltons in rebellion and were exterminated, their name erased from history. These cadet branches show how House Stark both expanded and pruned its family tree over the millennia, rewarding loyal kin and destroying those who betrayed them. For all their power, the Kings of Winter were not immune to tragedy and loss. The crypts of Winterfell filled with generation after generation of Starks, some who ruled long and died peacefully, others who fell in battle or were murdered by treachery. Children died young, claimed by winter illnesses or accidents. Entire branches of the family withered and died out, their names forgotten except for statues gathering dust in the deepest crypts. Yet the line continued, each generation passing the crown and the sword and the duty to the next. The words of House Stark are not a boast but a warning, a reminder that no matter how long summer lasts, winter will always return. The Starks shaped their lives around this truth, building their castle to withstand the cold, filling their granaries against the lean years, and teaching their children that the good times never last. They became hard because the land demanded it, but beneath that hardness was a core of duty and honor that would define the family for 8,000 years. The relationship between the Starks and the old gods of the North shaped much of their identity and practice. In the God's Wood of Winterfell stands a heart tree, an ancient weirwood with a face carved into its white bark, its red leaves rustling in winds that seem to come from nowhere. Here the Starks prayed and made their vows, standing before the eyes of gods who had been worshipped since before written history. The old gods have no temples, no priests, no songs of praise. They are the gods of the forest and the stream and the stone, nameless and watchful, and the Starks honored them in silence and in truth. When a Stark made a vow before the heart tree, he kept it, for the gods had witnessed and would know if he forswore himself. This bond between the Starks and the old gods gave them a reputation for honor that became central to their identity. A Stark's word was his bond, and this was known throughout Westeros. The Godswood of Winterfell is not merely a place of worship, but one of the few remaining vestiges of the great forests that once covered Westeros before the first men came and began cutting trees for their fires and their homes. 3 acres of old forest grow within the castle walls, a tangle of oak and ironwood and sentinel trees that have stood for thousands of years. At its heart sits the weirwood, its bone-white trunk and blood-red leaves unmistakable against the darker wood around it. The face carved into its bark is ancient beyond reckoning, its deep-cut eyes seeming to follow those who walk beneath its branches. In winter, the pool before the heart tree steams with warmth from the hot springs below, and snow melts before it touches the water. Here, beneath the gaze of the old gods, Starks have been born and named, have sworn their vows and wed their brides, have confessed their fears and sought guidance. The weirwood has witnessed it all and forgets nothing. For nearly 8,000 years, the Starks ruled as kings of winter, independent and unbowed, answering to no power beyond their own walls. But all things must end, and the reign of the Stark kings came to its close in the year 2nd BC, when Aegon Targaryen and his sisters landed at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush with 3 dragons and a dream of conquest. The last king of winter was Torrhen Stark, a man who would have to make the most consequential decision in his family's history. When word came of Aegon's invasion, Torrhen called his banners and marched south with 30,000 Northmen, determined to meet this foreign conqueror and defend his ancient crown. He crossed the Neck and came to the banks of the Trident, where he made his camp and prepared for battle. But when he looked across the river, he did not see just an army. He saw 3 dragons and fields still black and smoking from the battle that had ended the reign of Harren the Black. What he saw changed everything. King Torrhen sent his bastard brother Brandon, Snow, across the river to treat with Aegon, though Brandon reportedly offered instead to sneak into the Targaryen camp and kill the 3 dragons in the night. Torrhen refused this plan, whether from honor or pragmatism or both. He knew what dragons had done to Harrenhal, where the great castle's towers had melted like candles in the dragonfire. He knew what they had done to the combined armies of the Reach and the Westerlands at the Field of Fire, where 4,000 men had burned alive in a single afternoon. Torrhen was a king, but he was also a lord who had a duty to his people. He could march his Northmen against the dragons and watch them die in flames by the thousands, or he could bend the knee and preserve their lives. He chose to kneel. When he crossed the river and laid his crown at Aegon's feet, he ended 8,000 years of Stark kingship, and the men who had followed him called him the king who knelt forevermore. The decision haunted House Stark in the years that followed, with some seeing it as pragmatic wisdom and others as shameful surrender. Torrhen's own bannermen gave him that epithet, the king who knelt, and it was not meant as praise. Yet the North was spared the dragonfire that had consumed so many others, and the Starks remained the paramount house of the North, now as wardens rather than kings. Torrhen's crown, that ancient bronze circlet set with iron and 9 longsword points, was sent to the Targaryen treasury and never seen again. The Valyrian steel greatsword Ice remained with the Starks, for Aegon allowed them to keep their ancestral blade, but the crown was gone forever. Torrhen lived out the rest of his days as Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, the first Stark to hold those titles rather than king. He ruled well in peace, but history would remember him most for that single moment by the river when he knelt before a conqueror rather than die with his men. Under Targaryen rule, the North retained much of its autonomy. more so than any other region of the Seven Kingdoms. The Targaryens were wise enough to recognize that the North was too vast and too different to govern closely from King's Landing. The old gods still held sway where the Seven had never taken root. The First Men's blood still ran pure where Andal lineages dominated elsewhere, and the harsh climate bred a people who had little patience for southern customs and courts. The Starks continued to rule from Winterfell much as they always had, collecting taxes and dispensing justice and defending their borders. They answered to the Iron Throne in matters of war and great policy, but in the daily governance of their lands, they remained largely independent. This arrangement suited both parties, for the Targaryens gained the North's loyalty without the trouble of trying to directly control it, and the Starks maintained their power and pride despite no longer wearing a crown. The Starks intermarried occasionally with southern houses during the Targaryen era, slowly building connections beyond the neck that had traditionally isolated them. Yet they remained firmly northern in character and custom, and their vassals followed suit. When the faith of the Seven attempted to spread into the north, it gained only modest footholds, primarily in White Harbor, where the Manderleys, transplants from the Reach, maintained their southern faith. The great houses of the north kept to the old gods, and the Starks led by example, never wavering from the weirwood and the heart tree. They built no septs in Winterfell, employed no septons, and swore their oaths before the old gods as their ancestors had done. This religious divide would sometimes create tension with the crown, but it also reinforced northern identity and Stark leadership. The Starks were the wardens of more than just a territory. They were the guardians of an entire way of life. 130 years after the conquest, the Targaryen dynasty tore itself apart in a brutal civil war known as the Dance of the Dragons. When Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen's claim to the throne was challenged by her half-brother Aegon II, the realm divided, and dragons fought dragons in the skies above Westeros. The North, under Lord Cragen Stark, declared for Rhaenyra, honoring a pact made years earlier between Rhaenyra's son Jacaerys and Cragen himself. This agreement, known as the Pact of Ice and Fire, promised that a Targaryen princess would one day marry into House Stark, binding the two houses by blood. Cragen took this pact seriously, for a Stark's word was his bond, and he called his banners to march south in support of the Queen. The army he raised was vast, drawn from every corner of the north, and they called themselves the Winter Wolves. Many of these men were old or younger sons with no inheritance, men who sought a glorious death in battle rather than a slow decline at home. The Winter Wolves marched south under Lord Roderick Dustin, while Cragen remained to gather an even larger host. These Northmen threw themselves into the war with a ferocity that shocked the Southerners, fighting in battle after battle with little regard for their own lives. At the Battle of the Fish Feed, they helped destroy a royalist army in a bloody engagement along the lakeshore. They fought again at the Second Battle of Tumbleton and in skirmishes across the Riverlands. By the time the war ended, most of the Winter Wolves were dead, having found the glorious end they sought. Lord Roderick Dustin himself fell in battle, as did thousands of other Northmen who had marched south seeking honor and death. They found both in abundance, and their sacrifice helped secure Rhaenyra's cause even as it bled the north of a generation of warriors. Cragen Stark himself arrived in King's Landing too late for the war, but in time for its aftermath. By the time his host reached the capital, Rhaenyra was dead, killed by her half-brother's dragon on Dragonstone. Aegon II had won, but his victory was short-lived. He died soon after, poisoned by his own men who feared what would happen when Cregan Stark and his army arrived. Cregan found a city in chaos, a king dead by treachery, and the throne claimed by Rhaenyra's young son, Aegon III. Rather than crown himself or make demands for the North, Cregan chose to dispense justice. He arrested the men who had poisoned Aegon II, for though Aegon had been his enemy, he had also been a king, and the murder of a king could not go unpunished. For 6 days, Cregan Stark served as Hand of the King, and in that time he held trials and passed sentences that would be remembered for centuries. Those 6 days became known as the Hour of the Wolf, though they lasted far longer than an hour. Cregan was merciless in his judgments, condemning 22 men to death for their roles in the poisoning and other crimes. Those who accepted execution were granted quick deaths by ice, the Stark Greatsword. Others were offered the chance to take the Black and join the Night's Watch, and many chose this option, swelling the Watch's ranks with men who might otherwise have faced the headsman. Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, was among those arrested, but he was eventually pardoned through the intercession of his granddaughter, the new queen. When his work was done, Cregan resigned as Hand and returned to the north. He had come south to fulfill a promise and to bring justice to those who had murdered a king, and having done both, he had no desire to remain in the Viper's Nest of King's Landing. The Hour of the Wolf became legendary, a demonstration of stark justice administered without fear or favor. The pact of ice and fire that had brought Cregan south was never fulfilled in his lifetime. The promised Targaryen princess never came north to marry into House Stark, one of many casualties of the Dance of the Dragons that had killed so many on both sides. Cregan eventually married 3 times, outliving his first 2 wives and fathering numerous children who would carry on the Stark line. He remained Lord of Winterfell for many years after the dance, ruling the north with the same iron hand he had shown in King's Landing. His reputation as a hard but just lord spread throughout the 7 kingdoms, and his descendants inherited both his position and his commitment to honor. The Hour of the Wolf had shown the realm what stark justice meant, and no one who witnessed it would forget. A Stark might be slow to anger and reluctant to involve himself in southern affairs, but once roused, he was implacable. In the generations that followed the Dance of the Dragons, the Starks continued their steady stewardship of the North, marrying their children to other great houses and maintaining their bannermen's loyalty through fairness and strength. Barthogen Stark, one of Cregan's sons, became known as Barth Blacksword, and served as Hand of the King to Aegon IV, one of the worst kings ever to sit the Iron Throne. Serving such a dissolute monarch must have tested Barthogen's patience severely, for Aegon IV was everything a Stark was not: dishonorable, gluttonous, lecherous, and cruel. Yet Barthogen served as best he could, trying to mitigate the damage of the king's worst impulses. When Aegon IV legitimized all his bastards on his deathbed, he sowed the seeds for generations of civil war that Barthogen could not have prevented. The Blackfyre rebellions that followed would test the realm's loyalty again and again. The Starks remained loyal to the Targaryen kings throughout the Blackfyre rebellions, standing against the bastard line that claimed the throne for itself. When Daemon Blackfyre raised his banner and declared himself king, the North marched south to fight for the legitimate Targaryen heir. Lord Stark led his men to the Battle of the Redgrass Field, where Daemon Blackfyre and his sons were slain and the rebellion crushed. Again, in the later rebellions, When Daemon's descendants made their own attempts on the throne, the Starks answered the call. This loyalty was not born of love for the Targaryens, but of the same sense of duty and honor that had governed the Starks for millennia. They had sworn oaths to the Iron Throne when Torrhen knelt, and they would keep those oaths regardless of their personal feelings about the kings who sat upon it. A Stark's word was a Stark's bond. During the 2nd century after the conquest, a Stark daughter named Sarah was courted by Prince Aemon Targaryen, the Dragon Knight himself. According to the stories, Aemon met Sarah at a tourney in the north and fell deeply in love with her. They wished to marry, but King Aegon III forbade it, unwilling to let his heir wed a northern girl who kept the old gods. Sarah Stark's fate after this rejection varies by the tale. Some say she became a silent sister, others that she threw herself from a tower, and still others that she simply returned to Winterfell and lived out her days in sorrow. The truth has been lost to time, but the story speaks to the divide that still existed between the North and the South, between the old gods and the new. Even after centuries of Targaryen rule, the Starks remained distinct, and that distinction sometimes came at a personal cost. The Starks of this era were largely unremarkable individually, which is perhaps the greatest compliment that can be paid to a ruling house. They governed fairly, kept the peace, and passed Winterfell from father to son without catastrophe or civil war. No great rebellions rose against them. No terrible winters caught them unprepared. No disasters befell the North through their mismanagement. This steady competence earned little glory but ensured stability, and the small folk of the North prospered under their rule as much as small folk can prosper in a harsh land. The great deeds were behind them, and though they did not know it, ahead of them as well. For now, the Starks simply endured, season after season, generation after generation, keeping faith with their ancestors and preparing for whatever winter might come. By the middle of the 3rd century after the conquest, the Starks had been wardens of the North for nearly 300 years. In that time, they had fought in the Dance of the Dragons and multiple Blackfire rebellions, had intermarried with dozens of houses both northern and southern, and had maintained their position as the paramount power in the North. The transition from kings to lords had not diminished them as much as some had feared when Torrhen knelt. They still ruled from Winterfell, still commanded the loyalty of houses that had followed them for thousands of years, still married and buried their dead in the ancient ways. The crown was gone, but the essence of Stark rule remained. They were still the guardians of the North, the keepers of the old ways, the family whose words warned all who heard them. Winter is coming, the Starks said, and they meant it as much now as they had when Brandon the Builder first laid the stones of Winterfell. The words of House Stark serve not as a boast, but as a reminder, a constant warning to themselves and to others that good times do not last, and one must always prepare for the worst. While other houses chose words that proclaimed their strength or their ferocity, the Starks chose caution and foresight. Winter is coming could mean the literal winter that grips the North for years at a time, when snows pile so high that villages are buried and people freeze in their homes. It could mean metaphorical winters, times of war and hardship and sorrow that come to all families eventually. It could mean the great winter of legend, the long night when the others came and the dead walked, and the sun hid its face for a generation. Whatever winter it warned of, the message was the same. Be ready. Do not grow complacent in summer. Do not forget that darkness always returns. This philosophy shaped the Starks into the house they became, serious and dutiful, and prepared for the worst while hoping for the best. The years passed in their steady rhythm, and by the middle of the 3rd century after the conquest, lordship of Winterfell came to Rickard Stark, a man whose ambitions would reach far beyond the traditional isolation of the North. Rickard was not content to simply govern his lands and maintain the old ways. He looked south, past the Neck and the Twins, past the Trident and the Crown lands, and he saw opportunity. For too long, he believed, the North had stood apart from the rest of the realm, marrying within itself and ignoring the great game of alliance and influence that the southern houses played so skillfully. Rickard determined to change this. He would bind House Stark to the great powers of the South through marriage and fosterage, creating a network of alliances that would make the North a player in southern politics for the first time since the conquest. His vision was bold, perhaps too bold, for it would set in motion events that none could have foreseen. Rickard's first move was to betroth his eldest son and heir, Brandon, to Catelyn Tully, daughter of Lord Hoster Tully of Riverrun. The Tullys commanded the Riverlands, that fertile crossroads between North and South, and an alliance with them would give the Starks a powerful friend below the Neck. Rickard then sent his second son, Eddard, to be fostered in the Vale of Arryn, where he would be raised alongside Robert Baratheon, heir to Storm's End. This was unusual, for northern lords typically fostered their sons with other northern houses, but Rickard wanted his children to forge bonds with the great houses of the South. The final piece was the betrothal of his only daughter, Lyanna, to Robert Baratheon himself. When these marriages were complete, House Stark would be bound by blood and friendship to the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Stormlands, a coalition of 4 great houses that could rival even the power of the Iron Throne. Brandon Stark, Rickard's heir, grew into a young man of passion and impulsiveness, who seemed to have inherited all the fire that the North was said to lack. He was tall and handsome, skilled with a sword, and quick to anger. People called him the Wild Wolf, and the name fit him well. Unlike his quieter brother Eddard, Brandon burned bright and hot, attracting attention wherever he went. He was everything a young lord should be on the surface, brave and strong and charming. But beneath that surface was a recklessness that would prove his undoing. Brandon did not think before he acted. He followed his heart and his temper wherever they led, and they did not always lead him wisely. He loved fiercely and fought fiercely, and lived as though there would always be time to correct his mistakes later. There would not be. Brandon was betrothed to Catelyn Tully, and by all accounts she was half in love with him before they even met. He was the heir to Winterfell, dashing and bold, the kind of figure that songs are written about. When they finally met at Riverrun, Catelyn fell the rest of the way. Brandon was charming and attentive, and he seemed to return her affection with the same easy warmth he showed to everyone. Whether he truly loved her, or simply played the part expected of him, Catelyn believed herself fortunate beyond measure. She would be Lady of Winterfell, wife to a man who seemed born to rule and to conquer hearts. She did not know that she would never marry Brandon, that fate had other plans for both of them, and that she would come to Winterfell as the bride of a different Stark entirely. Lyanna Stark was the only daughter of Rickard Stark, and she was as wild in her own way as her brother Brandon. She loved to ride more than anything, spending hours in the saddle racing across the northern hills with her hair streaming behind her. She was not interested in needlework or dancing or the other pursuits expected of high-born ladies. She wanted to fight, to ride, to live as freely, as her brothers did. Her father indulged her to a point, but he also knew that she had a duty to her house, and that duty meant marriage to a great lord who could strengthen the Stark position. Robert Baratheon seemed an ideal match on paper. He was young, strong, handsome, and heir to one of the great houses of the realm. Rickard and Robert's father agreed to the betrothal, and Lyanna's fate seemed sealed. But Lyanna herself had doubts that she shared with her brother Eddard. Doubts about Robert's character and his ability to be faithful to one woman. The year 281 AC brought the great tourney at Harrenhal, the largest and most lavish tournament the realm had seen in many years. Lords and knights came from every corner of Westeros to compete for glory and prizes, and the Starks were among them. Rickard came with his sons Brandon and Eddard and Benjen, and with his daughter Lyanna. It should have been a time of celebration, a chance for the great houses to mingle and for young knights to prove their valor. Instead, the tourney at Harrenhal became the seedbed of tragedy. Something happened there, something involving Lyanna and Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, that would change the course of history. The exact truth of what occurred has been debated ever since, but its consequences were catastrophic for House Stark and for the realm. Prince Rhaegar Targaryen was the heir to the Iron Throne, a man of melancholy beauty, who was said to be more interested in books and music than in fighting, though he was skilled at arms when he chose to be. He was already married to Princess Aelia Martell of Dorne, with whom he had 2 children. At the tourney of Harrenhal, Rhaegar competed in the joust and defeated all challengers, winning the right to crown any woman he chose as Queen of Love and Beauty. All expected him to crown his wife, as custom demanded. Instead, Rhaegar rode past Elia and laid the crown of blue winter roses in the lap of Lyanna Stark. The crowd fell silent. In that moment, Rhaegar had publicly dishonored his wife and declared his interest in another man's betrothed. Eddard Stark later remembered that all the smiles died at Harrenhal, and he was right. That crown of roses was the first petal of what would become a bloody bloom. Another incident at Harrenhal involved a mystery knight known as the Knight of the Laughing Tree. During the tourney, a small Crannog man named Howland Reed was attacked and beaten by 3 squires from other houses. Lyanna Stark reportedly found him and tended his wounds, and the next day a mystery knight appeared wearing mismatched armor and a shield painted with a laughing weirwood tree. This knight challenged the 3 squires' masters and defeated them all, demanding that they teach their squires honor. The knight then vanished and was never identified, though King Aerys became convinced that the mystery knight was an enemy and sent Rhaegar to find him. Rhaegar returned with only the shield, claiming he found no knight. Many have speculated that Lyanna herself was the Knight of the Laughing Tree, that she had donned armor to avenge the Crannog man she had befriended. If Rhaegar discovered her identity, it might explain what happened next between them. Less than a year after the tourney, Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark disappeared together. What exactly happened remains one of the great mysteries of recent history. Robert Baratheon and most of the realm believed that Rhaegar abducted Lyanna against her will, that he stole her away and violated her, proving himself a monster despite his reputation for honor and gentleness. Others whispered different stories. They said Lyanna went willingly, that she loved Rhaegar and fled with him rather than marry a man she did not want. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes, or it may be stranger still. What is certain is that Lyanna left with Rhaegar, that she ended up at a tower in the mountains of Dorne called the Tower of Joy, and that she would never return to the north alive. When news of Lyanna's disappearance reached Brandon Stark, he reacted with all the hot-blooded fury that had earned him the name Wild Wolf. He did not wait for his father's counsel, did not pause to consider the consequences. He rode straight to King's Landing with a small group of companions and stormed into the Red Keep, shouting for Rhaegar to come out and die. It was an act of suicidal courage, or perhaps simply suicide. Rhaegar was not even in King's Landing. He had gone to ground with Lyanna and could not be found. Instead, Brandon's challenge was answered by King Aerys II, the Mad King, who had Brandon and his companions arrested on charges of plotting to murder the Crown Prince. Aerys then sent ravens to the fathers of Brandon's companions, demanding they come to King's Landing to answer for their son's crimes. It was a trap, and the fathers walked into it. Rickard Stark came to King's Landing to ransom his son, expecting a trial or at least the chance to speak in Brandon's defense. He found neither. King Aerys had descended fully into madness by this time, seeing enemies everywhere and trusting no one. He accused Rickard of treason and offered him trial by combat. But when Rickard demanded his rights as a lord and called for his sword and armor, Aerys declared that fire was the champion of House Targaryen. Rickard was suspended from the rafters of the throne room in his armor while a fire was lit beneath him. He was burned alive slowly, roasting inside his own steel as the court watched in horror. Brandon was brought in to watch his father die, a leather cord around his neck and a sword just out of reach. The more he struggled to reach the sword to save his father, the tighter the cord became, until he strangled himself in his desperate efforts. Father and son died together in the throne room, and the horror of their deaths lit a fire that would burn down a dynasty. The deaths of Rickard and Brandon Stark shattered the peace of the realm and transformed simmering anger into open rebellion. King Aerys, not content with the murders he had already committed, sent word to Jon Arryn in the Vale demanding that he execute his two wards, Eddard Stark and Robert Baratheon, as traitors to the crown. Jon Arryn was faced with an impossible choice: kill the two young men he had raised as sons, or defy the king and bring war upon his house. He chose defiance. Jon Arryn raised his banners in rebellion, and Eddard and Robert rode out to raise their own. The rebellion that followed would be called Robert's Rebellion for the man who led it and claimed the throne at its end. But it began as a war of survival for three houses that Aerys had declared outlaw. The Starks, the Baratheons, and the Arryns fought not for glory or conquest, but because the Mad King had given them no other choice. Eddard Stark became Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North with the deaths of his father and brother, a position he had never expected and never wanted. He was the second son, the quiet one, raised to support his older brother rather than rule in his own right. Now Brandon was dead. His father was dead. His sister was missing, and the full weight of House Stark had fallen on his shoulders. He was barely a man grown, thrust into leadership of the North during its greatest crisis since the conquest. Eddard had to rally his bannermen, march them south to war, and try to rescue his sister from whatever fate had befallen her. He also had to marry. Brandon's death left Catelyn Tully without a betrothed, and the alliance between Stark and Tully was more important now than ever. Eddard rode to Riverrun and married Catelyn in Brandon's place, wedding a woman who had loved his brother and who barely knew him at all. The marriage between Eddard and Catelyn Stark was one of duty and necessity, performed in haste before Eddard marched off to war. They spent a single night together at River Run before he left, and in that night Catelyn conceived their first child, a son who would be named Robb. Catelyn barely knew the man she had married. He was quiet where Brandon had been bold, reserved where Brandon had been warm. She did not know if he would return from the war, did not know if she would ever see him again after that single night. But she did her duty as he did his, and in time that marriage of necessity would become one of genuine love and partnership. Catelyn came to know the man Eddard Stark truly was, honorable and kind beneath his northern reserve, and she loved him for it. But that love would take years to grow. When he rode away from River Run, she watched him go with uncertainty in her heart. The war that followed was long and bloody, fought across the Riverlands and the Crownlands, and finally at the gates of King's Landing itself. Eddard fought in the major battles alongside Robert Baratheon and Jon Arryn, commanding the northern forces with a steadiness that earned his men's respect. He was not the warrior his brother had been, not as flashy or as fierce, but he was dependable and he was brave. The Starks and their allies won victory after victory, culminating in Robert's triumph over Rhaegar at the Battle of the Trident. Rhaegar died with Robert's warhammer crushing his chest, and with him died the hopes of the Targaryen dynasty. King's Landing fell shortly afterward, sacked by the Lannister army that had arrived late and changed sides at the last moment. When Eddard rode into the city, he found Jaime Lannister sitting on the Iron Throne and the bodies of Rhaegar's children lying before it, murdered on Tywin Lannister's orders. The war was won, but Lyanna was still missing. Eddard learned that she was being held at the Tower of Joy in the Mountains of Dorne, guarded by 3 of the finest knights in the realm: Sir Arthur Dayne, the Sword of the Morning, Sir Oswell Went, and Lord Commander Gerald Hightower of the Kingsguard. Eddard rode south with 6 companions to find his sister. When they reached the tower, the 3 Kingsguard refused to let them pass. A battle ensued, and when it was over, only Eddard and Howland Reed remained alive. All 3 Kingsguard were dead, as were Eddard's other companions. Eddard climbed the tower and found Lyanna in a bed soaked with blood, dying despite all efforts to save her. She made him promise something before she died, and he held her hand as the life faded from her eyes. Whatever she asked him, Eddard kept that promise for the rest of his life, and he never told anyone what it was, not even his wife. Eddard brought Lyanna's bones home to Winterfell and laid her to rest in the crypts beneath the castle, in a tomb he had made for her with a statue carved in her likeness. By tradition, only the Lords of Winterfell and the Kings of Winter had statues in the crypts, but Eddard broke with tradition for his sister. He loved her deeply and blamed himself for not protecting her, for not reaching her in time. He visited her tomb often over the years, standing in silence before her stone face, perhaps speaking to her of things he could tell no one else. The other dead of the rebellion joined her in time. Brandon and Rickard in their own tombs, the 3 generations of Starks who had fallen in those terrible years. Eddard was left as the head of his house, Lord of Winterfell, with a wife and a newborn son and a realm to rebuild. The war was over, and a new age had begun. When Eddard Stark returned to Winterfell after the war, he did not return alone. He brought with him an infant boy he claimed as his own bastard son, a child he named Jon Snow. This was shocking to everyone who knew Eddard, for he was the most honorable man in the 7 kingdoms, the last person anyone would expect to father a child outside of marriage. Yet here was the proof. a baby with dark hair and gray eyes that looked so much like Eddard himself. When Catelyn asked who the mother was, Eddard refused to say. He would only tell her that Jon was his blood, and that was all she needed to know. His silence on the matter was absolute, and it created a wound between husband and wife that never fully healed. Catelyn accepted Jon's presence in Winterfell because she had no choice, but she never accepted Jon himself. She could not love the living reminder of her husband's one lapse from honor, and Jon grew up knowing that he was unwanted by at least one person in his home. The truth of Jon Snow's parentage remains one of the great mysteries of recent history, at least to those who do not know the secret Eddard carried to his grave. Many assumed his mother was a common woman Eddard had bedded during the war. Perhaps Willa, a wet nurse in the service of House Dane. Others whispered that she was Ashara Dane, a great beauty with whom Eddard was said to have danced at the tourney of Harrenhal. Ashara threw herself from a tower into the sea after the war, and some connected her death to the birth of Jon Snow. Eddard never confirmed any of these stories. He spoke of Jon's mother only once to King Robert, saying her name was Willa, and he refused to discuss the matter ever again. Whatever promise he made to Lyanna in that bloody tower room, keeping Jon's secret was clearly part of it, and Eddard kept that secret at the cost of his own reputation and his wife's peace of mind. Eddard and Catelyn's marriage began in duty, but grew into deep and genuine love over the years that followed the war. They built a life together at Winterfell, ruling the North and raising their children in the old ways that the Starks had followed for thousands of years. Catelyn converted to the old gods for her husband's sake, praying before the heart tree alongside him, though she kept the faith of the Seven in her heart as well. She learned the ways of the North, its harsh climate and its proud people, and she became a true Lady of Winterfell. Eddard relied on her counsel and respected her wisdom, and she came to know and love the quiet, honorable man she had married in her brother's place. They were partners in every sense, and the children they raised together bore the stamp of both their natures, Stark and Tully, ice and water, duty and family. Robb Stark was born in Riverrun while his father was away at war, and he did not meet Eddard until the fighting was done and the new king crowned. He was the heir to Winterfell from his first breath, raised to rule the North someday, and taught all the skills he would need to do so. Robb had his mother's coloring, the auburn hair and blue eyes of the Tullys, but his heart was pure Stark. He was serious and dutiful, conscious of his responsibilities even as a young boy. He trained at swords with his brothers and half-brother, learned to ride and to hunt, studied the histories of his house and his land. He was close with Jon Snow especially, the two eldest boys growing up almost as twins despite the difference in their status. When Robb laughed, Jon laughed with him, and when Robb fought, Jon fought beside him. Their bond was the bond of brothers in truth, whatever the law might say about legitimacy. Sansa Stark was the eldest daughter, and she took after her mother in more than just appearance. She had Catelyn's Tully looks and Catelyn's love of songs and stories, of knights and ladies and the courtly life of the South. Where her siblings embraced the harsh northern ways, Sansa dreamed of a different world, one of tournaments and balls and handsome princes who would sweep her off her feet. She was a proper lady, skilled at needlework and courtesy, always saying the right thing at the right time. She believed in the stories she had been told, that life was like the songs, and that good always triumphed over evil. This innocence made her beautiful in a way, but it also left her unprepared for the world as it truly was. She would learn the truth soon enough, and the lessons would be cruel beyond anything she could have imagined in her girlhood dreams. Arya Stark was as different from her sister as winter from summer. Where Sansa was proper and ladylike, Arya was wild and willful, more interested in swords than in sewing. She had the long face of the Starks and her father's gray eyes, and people said she looked like Lyanna had at her age. She hated being told to act like a lady, hated sitting still for lessons in needlework and dancing. She wanted to learn to fight, to ride, to do all the things her brothers did. Her father indulged her more than he probably should have, perhaps seeing his lost sister in her, and unable to deny her the freedom Lyanna had loved. Arya was close with Jon Snow, who understood what it felt like to not quite fit in, to be somehow other than what you were supposed to be. Before he left for the Wall, Jon gave her a gift that would become the most precious thing she owned, a slender sword she named Needle. Brandon Stark, called Bran, was the second son and a boy who dreamed of knighthood. He wanted to be a knight of the Kingsguard, to wear the white cloak and defend the king with his life. He loved to climb, scaling the walls and towers of Winterfell with a fearlessness that terrified his mother. Catelyn forbade him to climb 100 times, but Bran never listened. He knew every stone of the castle, every handhold and foothold, every way up and every way down. He could climb anything, go anywhere, see everything. His climbing would lead him to a discovery that would change his life and the fate of the realm, but it would also cost him dearly. Bran was only 7 years old when he climbed a tower and found something he was never meant to see, and his life was never the same afterward. Rickon Stark was the youngest, still a small child when the events that shattered his family began to unfold. He was too young to understand what was happening, too young to know why his father rode south and never came back, why his mother left and his brothers went to war. All he knew was that his family was disappearing one by one, and his response was anger and fear that he could not articulate. His direwolf Shaggy Dog was as wild as he was, a black-furred beast that snarled at everyone and could barely be controlled. Rickon clung to his wolf as his world fell apart, the two of them growing wilder together as the structures of his life collapsed. He was a child of winter, born into a summer that was ending, and he would know more of loss than any child should have to bear. The direwolves came to the Stark children on a summer day, when Eddard was returning from an execution. He had taken his sons to watch him pass sentence on a deserter from the Night's Watch, as was his duty, for the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. On the way home, they found a dead direwolf in the snow, killed by a stag's antler lodged in her throat. The direwolf had been pregnant, and around her body were 5 pups, still alive despite their mother's death. Eddard's first instinct was to kill the pups quickly, for they would die anyway without their mother. But Jon Snow pointed out that there were 5 pups and 5 true-born Stark children. This was a sign, Jon said, for the direwolf was the sigil of House Stark. Eddard relented and allowed his children to keep the wolves, and as they rode away, Jon found a 6th pup that had crawled away from the others. An albino runt, white as snow. That one would be his. The direwolves grew with their masters, bonding with the Stark children in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Each wolf matched its owner in temperament. Grey Wind was fierce and brave like Robb. Lady was gentle and trusting like Sansa. Nymeria was willful and independent like Arya. Summer was steady and thoughtful like Bran. Shaggy Dog was wild and angry like Rickon, and Ghost was silent and watchful like Jon. The wolves were more than pets. They were extensions of the children themselves, bound to them by something deeper than training. When a Stark child was in danger, their wolf knew it. When a wolf died, its master felt the loss like a wound to their own soul. The coming of the dire wolves was an omen, though whether for good or ill remained to be seen. Dire wolves had not been seen south of the wall for hundreds of years, and their return suggested that something was changing in the world. The years of peace that followed Robert's rebellion were good years for House Stark and for the North. Eddard ruled justly from Winterfell, dispensing justice and managing his lands with the same steady competence that had marked the best of his ancestors. He was not a lord who craved glory or expansion. He wanted only to do his duty, to raise his children well, and to leave the North in better condition than he found it. He rarely went south, having no love for the politics and intrigues of King's Landing. When King Robert summoned his lords to help put down the Greyjoy rebellion, Eddard answered the call and fought bravely. But he returned to the north as soon as the fighting was done. Winterfell was his home, and he had no desire to be anywhere else. He thought he would live out his days there, growing old with Catelyn, watching his children grow and have children of their own. He was wrong. In the year 298 AC, King Robert Baratheon came to Winterfell with his entire court, traveling for a month along the King's Road to reach the seat of his old friend. It was the first time Robert had visited the North since the war, and his arrival should have been a celebration. But Robert did not come merely to visit. He came because Jon Arryn, his Hand of the King, had died suddenly, and he needed someone he could trust to take Jon's place. There was only one man in the Seven Kingdoms that Robert trusted completely, and that was Eddard Stark. When Robert asked Eddard to come to King's Landing and serve as Hand, he was asking his friend to give up everything he loved. He was asking Eddard to leave his home, his wife, his lands, and enter a world of politics and conspiracy that was utterly foreign to his nature. Eddard did not want to go, but Robert was his king and his friend, and when duty called, Eddard Stark answered. There was another reason for Robert's visit, one that seemed happier on the surface. He proposed a marriage between his son Joffrey and Eddard's daughter Sansa, a match that would bind their houses together just as Robert and Eddard had once planned to be bound through Robert's marriage to Lyanna. Sansa was overjoyed at the prospect. Joffrey was the crown prince, golden-haired and handsome, the embodiment of every prince from the songs she loved. She would be queen someday, living in the Red Keep and presiding over tournaments and feasts. It was everything she had ever dreamed of. Eddard was less certain. He saw something in Joffrey that troubled him, a cruelty beneath the charm, but he could not refuse his king. The betrothal was agreed, and Sansa's fate was sealed along with her father's. They would go to King's Landing together into the Den of Lions, and neither would ever see Winterfell again. Before they left, tragedy struck the Stark family. Bran went climbing as he always did, scaling an abandoned tower in the older parts of the castle. At the top, he found a window, and through that window he saw something that would have shaken the realm to its foundations. Queen Cersei in the arms of her own brother, Jaime Lannister. They saw him too. Jaime looked at this child who had discovered the secret that could destroy his family, his sister, his children's claim to the throne, and he made a choice. He pushed Bran from the window. Bran fell 80 feet to the ground and should have died. He did not die, but he would never walk again. He lay in a coma for weeks while his family agonized over whether he would wake, and when he finally opened his eyes, he remembered nothing of what he had seen. But the Lannisters did not know that, and their fear of what he might remember would lead to more attempts on his life. Eddard rode south to King's Landing with a heavy heart, leaving his comatose son and grieving wife behind. He took Sansa and Arya with him, along with a household guard, but Catelyn stayed at Winterfell to care for Bran. The journey south was long, and it brought the first death to the Stark children's wolves. Along the King's Road, Joffrey and Sansa had an encounter with Arya and a butcher's boy she had been playing with. Joffrey attacked the boy with his sword, and when Arya's wolf Nymeria defended her, biting Joffrey's arm, the prince demanded the wolf be killed. Nymeria had fled, driven off by Arya to save her life, but Cersei would not be denied her blood. She demanded that a direwolf die, and when Nymeria could not be found, she chose Lady instead. Eddard killed the wolf himself rather than let the Lannisters do it, for the man who passes the sentence should swing the sword. Sansa never forgave him, and she never forgave herself for not speaking up to save her wolf. Lady was the first to die, but she would not be the last. King's Landing was everything Eddard Stark hated: hot, crowded, corrupt, and filled with people who smiled while they lied and lied while they smiled. He was a man of the North, direct and honest, and he did not know how to play the games that everyone in the capital played constantly. He trusted the wrong people, and suspected the wrong people, and could not tell friend from enemy because everyone wore the same mask. He discovered that Jon Arryn had been investigating the Queen's children before his death, and he began his own investigation. What he found horrified him. Joffrey and his siblings were not Robert's children at all. They were bastards born of incest between Cersei and Jaime Lannister. The blonde hair that all three children shared came from their mother and their father both, for they were the same bloodline. Robert had no true-born heirs, and the children everyone believed would inherit the throne were abominations in the eyes of gods and men. Eddard was faced with an impossible choice: tell Robert the truth and watch his friend destroy his wife and children, or keep silent and let bastards born of incest inherit the throne. He chose a middle path that would prove fatal. He confronted Cersei privately and told her he knew the truth, giving her a chance to flee with her children before he told Robert. It was an act of mercy born of his inability to see children harmed, even children born of such a union. But Cersei did not flee. She moved against him instead. Before Eddard could tell Robert anything, the king went hunting and was mortally wounded by a boar, made possible by wine that Cersei's own cousin had kept pouring all day. Robert died without knowing the truth about his children, and with his death, Eddard lost his only protection in the capital. Joffrey took the throne, Cersei took power as regent, and Eddard Stark stood alone against the lions. He tried to do the right thing one last time. Shah had Robert's true will, which named Eddard as Lord Regent and Protector of the Realm, until the true heir came of age. He tried to use the City Watch to secure the Red Keep and remove Cersei from power. But the City Watch had been bought by Littlefinger, who betrayed Eddard at the crucial moment. His guards were slaughtered, he was taken prisoner, and his household in King's Landing was put to the sword. His daughters were trapped in the city, Sansa a captive, and Arya vanished into the streets. Everything Eddard had tried to do, every attempt to serve honor and justice, had failed. He was accused of treason and thrown into the black cells beneath the Red Keep, where he would wait in darkness and filth while his fate was decided by his enemies. They brought him out to the steps of the great sept of Baelor to confess his crimes and take the black, trading his life for a life on the wall. He had agreed to lie, to call himself a traitor, because they told him Sansa would be safe if he did. It was the one lie of his life, and he told it for his daughter's sake. He stood before the crowd and said the words they wanted him to say, admitting to crimes he had not committed, naming himself a traitor when he was the most loyal man in the realm. He expected to be sent to the wall, to live out his days in ice and cold far from his family, but at least alive. Joffrey had other ideas. The boy king, cruel and stupid in equal measure, ignored the arrangements that had been made and called for Eddard's head. Sir Eilen Payne, the king's headsman, stepped forward with ice, the Stark ancestral sword, and Eddard Stark was beheaded with his own blade while his daughters watched. The news of Eddard Stark's death spread across the Seven Kingdoms like wildfire, and nowhere did it burn hotter than in the north. When Catelyn Stark learned that her husband had been executed as a traitor, the grief threatened to break her entirely. She had lost Brandon before she could marry him, had lost her father-in-law and good sister to the Mad King's cruelty. And now she had lost Eddard, the quiet, honorable man she had come to love more than she ever thought possible. But Catelyn was a Tully of Riverrun, and the words of her house were family, duty, honor. She could not collapse into grief while her children were scattered and in danger. Sansa was a prisoner in King's Landing, Arya was missing and presumed dead. Bran and Rickon were at Winterfell with enemies closing in, and Robb was marching south with an army at his back. Catelyn dried her tears and rode to join her son, for a mother's place was with her child, and her child was going to war. Robb Stark was 15 years old when he called the banners of the North and marched south to rescue his father. He was a boy still, barely old enough to be considered a man, and he was leading hardened warriors 3 times his age into a war against the most powerful family in Westeros. He had never commanded in battle, never led men to their deaths, never faced an enemy who wanted to kill him. All he had were the lessons his father had taught him and the loyalty of bannermen who followed him because he was Ned Stark's son. When news came that his father was dead, that loyalty transformed into something fiercer. The Northern Lords did not simply want to rescue their liege lord anymore. They wanted vengeance. They wanted independence. They wanted a king of their own blood, and they looked at Robb Stark and saw one. In the great hall of Riverrun, the great Jon Umber drew his sword and declared that the North would have no king but a Stark. One by one, the other lords followed, drawing their swords and crying out, "The king in the North." Robb Stark rose from his seat a lord and sat down again a king. The young wolf, they called him, this boy, king who had never lost a battle. Robb won his crown with a series of brilliant victories that stunned the realm. He captured Jaime Lannister, the finest knight in Westeros, at the Battle of the Whispering Wood. He smashed a Lannister army at the Battle of the Camps and lifted the siege of Riverrun. He invaded the Westerlands and burned Tywin Lannister's own lands, while the Old Lion was trapped in the Riverlands, unable to respond. Grey Wind fought beside him in every battle, the great direwolf tearing through enemy ranks and terrifying Lannister soldiers until they believed the young wolf could turn into a beast himself. Robb seemed blessed by the old gods, untouchable in combat, a born commander despite his youth. His men worshipped him, His enemies feared him, and for a brief shining moment, it seemed that the North might actually win its independence. But Robb Stark made mistakes that no amount of battlefield brilliance could overcome. The first and greatest was a matter of the heart. While recovering from a wound at the Crag, seat of House Westerling, Robb received news that Theon Greyjoy had taken Winterfell and killed his brothers Bran and Rickon. In his grief and despair, he turned to Jane Westerling for comfort, and that comfort became something more. When he woke in her bed the next morning, he knew he had dishonored her, and there was only one way to make it right. Robb married Jane Westerling in secret, breaking his betrothal to a daughter of House Frey. He chose love and honor over his alliance, and in doing so, he doomed himself and his cause. Walder Frey was not a man to forgive such a slight. He had been promised a queen, and instead he had been given an insult. He would have his revenge, and when it came, it would be terrible beyond imagining. Catelyn tried to hold her son's kingdom together even as it began to crumble. She served as Robb's advisor and envoy, negotiating with potential allies and trying to repair the damage his choices had caused. She did not approve of many of his decisions, particularly his marriage, but she stood by him because he was her son and her king. She also made decisions of her own that would have far-reaching consequences. When she learned that Bran and Rickon were dead, she went to the cell where Jaime Lannister was being held and looked at this man who had crippled her son, who had murdered her husband's men, who was an abomination in the eyes of gods and men. And then she released him. She freed Jaime Lannister and sent him to King's Landing with Brienne of Tarth, hoping to trade him for Sansa and Arya. It was an act of desperation, a mother's attempt to save her daughters, but it was also treason against her son, the king. Robb's bannermen were furious, and some began to question whether the Starks were fit to rule at all. The war turned against the North as allies fell away and enemies multiplied. Robb lost the Karstarks when he executed Lord Rickard Karstark for murdering Lannister prisoners. He lost any hope of an alliance with the Ironborn when Balon Greyjoy declared himself king and invaded the North instead of joining the war against the Lannisters. He lost the Freys when he broke his marriage pact, though he thought he could win them back with an apology and a different marriage. Robb decided to make amends to Walder Frey by offering his uncle Edmure Tully as a husband for one of Frey's daughters. The wedding would be held at the Twins, Walder Frey's seat, and Robb would attend personally to show his respect and rebuild the alliance. Catelyn did not trust Walder Frey, but the marriage was their best hope of regaining his support. They rode to the Twins with a small force, trusting in the laws of hospitality to keep them safe under Frey's roof. It was the last mistake they would ever make. The Red Wedding began as a celebration and ended as a slaughter. The wedding feast was held in the Great Hall of the Twins, and for a time, everything seemed well. Edmure was married to Rosalind Frey, who was surprisingly pretty for one of Walder's brood. Food and drink flowed freely, and the mood was festive despite the underlying tension. Then the doors were barred. Musicians in the gallery took up a song, The Reigns of Castamere, the song of Lannister victory over a rebellious vassal. Catelyn saw a man in Frey colors with a crossbow and knew. She screamed a warning to Robb, but it was too late. Crossbow bolts flew from the gallery into the Stark men below. Frey and Bolton soldiers fell upon the guests with swords and axes. Outside, the northern camp was being attacked, men slaughtered in their tents or cut down as they tried to flee. Grey Wind, locked in a kennel, howled and threw himself against the bars until they filled him with crossbow bolts. The king in the north was being murdered under a roof where he should have been sacred. Robb Stark died in his mother's arms, struck by crossbow bolts and then stabbed through the heart by Rose Bolton, who whispered, "Jaime Lannister sends his regards," as he drove in the blade. Catelyn had watched her son take arrow after arrow, had begged and pleaded for his life, had even taken Walder Frey's fool, grandson hostage, and threatened to cut his throat. None of it mattered. When Robb fell, Catelyn's mind broke. She clawed at her own face, tearing bloody furrows down her cheeks, screaming in a grief beyond words. They cut her throat and threw her body into the river. Naked and dishonored as her son's body was dishonored. Grey Wind's head sewn onto Robb's shoulders in mockery of the king who had fought with a wolf at his side. The Red Wedding violated every law of gods and men, the most fundamental breach of hospitality in the history of Westeros, and it destroyed House Stark's power in a single night. The North would not forget, but the North could not avenge. Sansa Stark had been a prisoner in King's Landing since her father's arrest, trapped in a cage of courtesy and fear. She survived by becoming what they wanted her to be, a pretty bird who sang the songs she was told to sing and said the words she was told to say. When Joffrey demanded she look at her father's head on a spike, she looked. When he had her beaten by his Kingsguard, she thanked him for the lesson. She learned to hide her true feelings behind a mask of perfect courtesy, to smile when she wanted to scream, to say, "I am loyal to my beloved Joffrey," when she wanted to claw his eyes out. It was the only way to survive. She was a child alone among enemies, with no protector and no hope of rescue, and she did what she had to do. The innocent girl who had ridden south dreaming of princes and tournaments was gone, replaced by someone harder and warier, someone who understood that the world was not like the songs. She was forced to marry Tyrion Lannister, the imp, a match designed to humiliate her and give the Lannisters a claim to Winterfell through her. Tyrion was kinder than she expected, refusing to consummate the marriage until she was willing, but he was still a Lannister, still part of the family that had destroyed her own. Sansa endured the marriage as she endured everything else, with courtesy and silence and a heart full of unspoken rage. Her escape came at last on the night of Joffrey's wedding, when the king choked to death on poisoned wine and Sansa was spirited away in the chaos. Peter Baelish, Littlefinger, had arranged both the murder and her rescue, though Sansa did not know about the former at the time. He took her to the Vale of Arryn, where her aunt Lisa ruled as regent and gave her a new identity. Elaine Stone, his bastard daughter. Sansa Stark vanished, and in her place was a girl with dyed hair and a false name, hiding in the mountains while the world thought her a kingslayer. Arya Stark's journey took her through darkness that would have broken many grown men, let alone a child of 9. When her father was arrested, she was in the streets of King's Landing with her dancing master, Syrio Forel, who died defending her from Lannister guards. She hid in the city, living like a rat in the alleys, until the day they brought her father to the Sept of Baelor. She was in Ain, the crowd, watching, when Sir Elyn Payne swung ice and took her father's head. A man of the Night's Watch grabbed her and kept her from rushing forward, then cut her hair and told her she was now a boy named Aery, bound for the Wall. She fled King's Landing in a wagon full of recruits and criminals, holding Needle close and remembering the names of everyone she wanted to kill. The road north was a nightmare of violence and loss. The wagon was attacked, and Arya was captured and taken to Harrenhal, where she served as a cupbearer while the war raged around her. She saw horrors there, people tortured and killed in ways she could not have imagined in her worst dreams. She also met a man named Jaqen Hagar, who gave her 3 deaths in payment for 3 lives she had saved. Arya used those deaths to help take Harrenhal from its Lannister garrison, then escaped with her friends Gendry and Hot Pie. She was captured again by the Brotherhood Without Banners, then again by Sandor Clegane, the Hound, who meant to ransom her to her family. They arrived at the twins just in time for the Red Wedding, but too late to enter. Arya saw the slaughter from outside, saw her brother's men cut down and Greywind killed, and something inside her died as well. The Hound knocked her unconscious and carried her away before she could rush in and die with her family. She wandered the Riverlands with the Hound for a time, 2 broken creatures with nowhere to go and no one who wanted them. When the Hound was wounded in a fight and left to die, Arya refused to give him mercy, refused to kill him quickly, though he begged for it. She left him under a tree and made her way to Salt Pans, where she found a ship from Braavos. She had a coin given to her by Jaqen Hagar, and words to speak, Valar Morghulis. The ship took her across the narrow sea to Braavos, where she found the House of Black and White, and asked to become one of the Faceless Men. They were assassins who served the many-faced god, the god of death, and they could teach her to be no one, to wear any face, to kill anyone. Arya Stark wanted to learn. She wanted to become death itself, so she could cross every name off her list. Bran Stark woke from his coma to find his world destroyed. He would never walk again, never be a knight, never do any of the things he had dreamed of doing. His father was gone, his mother was gone, his sisters were gone, and his brother was marching to war. Only Rickon was left, and Rickon was so young and so frightened that he could offer no comfort. Bran fell into despair, wishing he had died in the fall rather than live as a cripple. But then the dreams began. He dreamed of a 3-eyed crow that called him north, that promised to teach him to fly. He dreamed of seeing through the eyes of his dire wolf Summer, running through the forest with 4 legs instead of 2. He did not understand what the dreams meant, but they gave him something to hope for, something beyond the broken body that imprisoned him. When Theon Greyjoy took Winterfell, Bran and Rickon hid in the crypts beneath the castle with the wildling woman Osha and the stable boy Hodor. They stayed hidden while Theon searched for them, while he killed 2 miller's boys and displayed their bodies as Bran and Rickon's, while Winterfell burned around them. When they emerged, their home was a ruin. Bran knew he had to go north, to find the 3-eyed crow and learn what he was meant to become. He sent Rickon away with Osha, hoping his little brother would be safe with the Umbers or some other loyal house. Then Bran set out beyond the wall with Hodor, the Reeds, and his direwolf Summer, seeking answers in the frozen wilderness where the children of the forest once lived. He left everything he knew behind, a crippled boy dragged on a sledge into the most dangerous lands in the world, chasing dreams and a 3-eyed crow. The journey beyond the wall nearly killed them all. They faced whites, the reanimated corpses of the dead, and barely escaped with their lives. They were saved by a figure from the distant past, Cold Hands, a mysterious being who seemed to be a white himself but still retained his mind and his will. He led them through the frozen forest to a cave beneath a great weirwood tree, and there Bran found what he had been seeking. The 3-eyed crow was a man, ancient beyond measure, sitting on a throne of weirwood roots with 1 red eye and 1 eye socket filled by a root that grew through his skull. He had been a lord and a maester, and a brother of the Night's Watch, and he had been waiting in that cave for 100 years. He told Bran that he would never walk again, but he would fly. He would learn to see through the eyes of animals and birds, to look through weirwood trees into other places and other times, to become something more than human. He would become the three-eyed raven. Rickon Stark, the youngest of the Stark children, disappeared into the wilds of the north with Osha and his direwolf Shaggy Dog. He was only 6 years old, too young to understand what was happening or why he had to leave his home. All he knew was fear and anger, and Shaggy Dog reflected both, growing wilder and more dangerous with each passing day. They made their way to the island of Skagos, a harsh and forbidding place said to be home to cannibals and unicorns. There, Rickon waited, hidden from the world, while events moved on without him. He was too young to affect anything, too young to fight or lead or even understand the wars that had torn his family apart. He was a child in hiding, and his story remains unfinished. The last true-born son of Eddard Stark waits on Skagos, and no one knows what fate will find him there. Jon Snow grew up in Winterfell as the outsider within, loved by his father and siblings but never quite belonging to the family whose name he could not share. He was a bastard, a Snow, and that single word defined his existence no matter how much Eddard Stark tried to treat him as a son. He could not sit with the family at feasts when important guests were present, for Lady Catelyn would not allow it. He could not hope to inherit anything, for bastards had no claims. He could not even know who his mother was, for his father refused to speak of her. Jon learned early that he would have to make his own way in the world, that no matter how much he loved his siblings, he would never truly be one of them. This knowledge shaped him, making him serious and watchful, always aware of his place and careful not to overstep it. He was a Stark in everything but name, and that was precisely the problem. His closest bond among his siblings was with Arya, the little sister who also felt like she did not fit in. Arya was too wild to be a proper lady, just as Jon was too baseborn to be a proper lord. They understood each other in a way the others could not. Jon also loved Robb like a true brother, and they trained together at swords and dreamed together of the glories they would win. But there was always a shadow between them, the knowledge that Robb would be Lord of Winterfell someday, while Jon would be nothing. Robb never treated Jon as lesser, but the world did, and Jon could not forget it. When he played at war with Robb, he always had to be the traitor or the wildling, never the king or the hero. Even in games, he was reminded of what he was. When Jon was 14, his uncle Benjen Stark came to Winterfell. Benjen was first ranger of the Night's Watch, a man who had given up his inheritance to serve on the Wall, and Jon saw in him a possible future for himself. The Night's Watch was the one place in Westeros where a man's birth did not matter. On the Wall, bastards could rise to command, could earn honor and respect through their deeds rather than their blood. Jon asked Benjen to take him to the Wall, and though his uncle tried to dissuade him, warning him that the Watch was not the glorious brotherhood it appeared to be, Jon's mind was set. When Eddard rode south to become Hand of the King, Jon rode north to become a brother of the Night's Watch. He said goodbye to Bran, who lay comatose and might never wake. He said goodbye to Robb, not knowing he would never see his brother again. He gave Arya a sword called Needle and told her to stick them with the pointy end. Then he rode away from the only home he had ever known. The Wall was everything Benjen had warned him about, and nothing like Jon had imagined. Castle Black was undermanned and falling apart. its brothers a collection of criminals and outcasts rather than noble warriors. The other recruits resented Jon for his castle training and his superior skills, and he made enemies before he made friends. He was arrogant at first, looking down on his fellow recruits because they could not fight as well as he could, not understanding that they had never had his advantages. Tyrion Lannister, who had traveled to the Wall to see it, told Jon some hard truths that began to change his perspective. Jon realized that he had been feeling sorry for himself when others had suffered far more than he ever had. He began to help the other recruits train, to use his skills to lift them up rather than to set himself apart. He made friends: Samwell Tarly, Grenn, Pip, and others who would become his brothers in truth as well as name. Jon was chosen as steward to Lord Commander Jorah Mormont, the Old Bear, which seemed like a slight until he realized it meant he was being groomed for command. Mormont saw something in Jon, a potential for leadership that the young man did not yet see in himself. Jon learned from the Old Bear how to lead men, how to make hard decisions, how to put duty before personal feelings. He also discovered that his direwolf ghost could sense the presence of whites, the undead creatures that served the others. When whites attacked Castle Black, it was Ghost who warned Jon in time, and it was Jon who saved the Lord Commander's life by burning the white with fire. For this, Mormont gave Jon his family sword, Longclaw, a Valyrian steel blade with a pommel shaped like a wolf's head. It was an extraordinary gift, the kind of blade that was worth a small fortune and carried the weight of generations. Jon had come to the Wall with nothing, and now he carried a sword fit for a lord. The great ranging beyond the Wall nearly killed him, and changed him in ways he could not have anticipated. Mormont led 300 brothers into the haunted forest to learn what had happened to Benjen Stark, and to discover what the wildlings were planning. Jon was sent to infiltrate the wildlings by pretending to desert the Watch, and to make his deception convincing, he had to do things that broke his vows. He was taken by a wildling woman named Ygritte, fierce and funny, and utterly unlike anyone he had ever known. She challenged everything he believed about wildlings, showing him that they were people just like the folk south of the Wall, not monsters. Jon came to care for her, and eventually to lie with her, breaking his vow of celibacy. It was the first time he had been with a woman, and it happened with an enemy of the Watch, and he did not regret it even as he knew he was betraying everything he had sworn to uphold. Jon learned the wildlings' plans and escaped back to Castle Black to warn his brothers. Ygritte and a band of raiders followed him, and when they attacked Castle Black, she was among them. Jon found her dying from an arrow wound, shot by one of his own brothers, and he held her as the life faded from her eyes. She said he knew nothing, the same thing she had always told him, and then she was gone. Jon had loved her, as much as a man could love in such circumstances, and losing her left a wound that would never fully heal. He had done his duty and betrayed her in the process, and he would carry that weight for the rest of his life. The Watch and the wildlings were enemies, and there was no room for love between them. But the heart does not care about such things, and Jon's heart had been given to a woman he could never have kept. The wildling assault on Castle Black came soon after, thousands of wildlings attacking the Wall, while Jon and his brothers defended it with only 100 men. The battle lasted days, and Jon emerged as one of its heroes, leading the defense and inspiring his brothers to hold against impossible odds. When the battle was done and the wildlings defeated by the arrival of Stannis Baratheon's army, Jon found himself one of the most respected men in Castle Black. Stannis offered to legitimize him, to make him Jon Stark instead of Jon Snow, and grant him Winterfell as his seat. It was everything Jon had ever wanted, the name and the home that had always been just out of reach. He was tempted. He was so tempted that he nearly said yes. But he had sworn vows to the Night's Watch, vows that lasted until death, and he could not break them. He refused Stannis and remained Jon Snow, a brother of the Watch. The brothers elected Jon as their new Lord Commander, the 998th man to hold that title. He was young for such a position, younger than any Lord Commander in living memory, but his actions during the battle had earned him the respect of his brothers. Jon took command of a watch that was broken and depleted, facing an enemy beyond the wall that most of the realm did not believe existed. He knew that the true enemy was not the wildlings, but the others, the White Walkers of ancient legend, and that the living would need to stand together to survive what was coming. Jon made a decision that many of his brothers could not accept. He allowed the wildlings through the wall to settle on the Gift, the lands south of the wall that belonged to the Watch. He would give his ancient enemies refuge because the alternative was to let them die and rise again as soldiers in the army of the dead. The decision tore the Night's Watch apart. Many brothers saw it as treason, as allowing the enemy to pass the very wall they had sworn to defend. They did not understand, or did not care, that the real enemy was coming, and that every wildling who died would become a White to fight against the living. Jon tried to explain, tried to make them see that the old feuds no longer mattered, that survival required them to put aside generations of hatred. Some brothers understood and supported him. Others muttered and plotted and waited for their chance. Jon knew he was making enemies within his own ranks, but he did what he believed was right regardless of the cost to himself. A lord must make hard choices, and the hardest choices are the ones that others hate you for. Jon made those choices because someone had to, and he had sworn to be the shield that guards the realms of men. His brothers came for him on a cold night at Castle Black. They lured him out with news of his uncle Benjen, who had been lost beyond the wall for years. Jon followed them to a yard where a sign read, "Traitor," and he realized too late what was happening. His own brothers stabbed him one after another, each saying, "For the Watch," as he drove in his blade. Jon fell to the ground in the snow, his blood pooling beneath him, staring up at the cold stars. He had done what he believed was right, and this was his reward. The 998th Lord Commander of the Night's Watch died in the arms of the very men he had tried to save, murdered for the crime of seeing further than they could see. Ghost howled in the night, and Jon Snow's eyes closed for what seemed like the final time. The truth of Jon Snow's parentage, the secret that Eddard Stark carried to his grave, answers questions that have haunted the story since the beginning. The evidence strongly suggests, and the show confirmed, that Jon is not Ned's son at all. He is the son of Lyanna Stark and Rhaegar Targaryen, conceived during the time they spent together at the Tower of Joy. Lyanna died giving birth to him, and with her dying breath she made Ned promise to protect her child. If Robert Baratheon had known that Lyanna's son lived, he would have killed the boy without hesitation, for Robert's hatred of the Targaryens was boundless, and the child represented a potential rival to his throne. Ned Stark did the only thing he could do. He claimed Jon as his own bastard and raised him at Winterfell, letting the world believe that he had dishonored himself rather than reveal the truth and watch his nephew die. If this is true, and all signs point to it being so, then Jon Snow is not a Snow at all. He is the true-born son of Rhaegar Targaryen and Lyanna Stark, born of a secret marriage that made him legitimate. His real name may be Aegon Targaryen, or some other name his mother gave him before she died. He is the nephew of Daenerys Targaryen, and has a claim to the Iron Throne that is arguably stronger than hers. He is also, through his mother, the grandson of Rickard Stark, and the nephew of Eddard Stark, making him both a dragon and a wolf, ice and fire united in one person. Ned Stark sacrificed his honor and his reputation to protect this boy, letting even his own wife believe him to be unfaithful rather than speak a truth that could have meant Jon's death. It was the most loving and selfless act imaginable, and it cost Ned dearly. But he kept his promise to Lyanna until the very end. The fate of House Stark at the end of this tale is one of devastation and scattering, yet also of endurance that speaks to the family's ancient strength. Eddard is dead, executed as a traitor for trying to do the right thing. Catelyn is dead, murdered at the Red Wedding alongside her son. Robb is dead, his kingdom destroyed, and his body desecrated. Rickon is missing, hidden on Skagos with his wild wolf. Bran is beyond the wall, becoming something more and less than human in the cave of the Three-Eyed Raven. Arya is in Braavos, training to become a faceless assassin. Sansa is in the Vale, hiding under a false name while Littlefinger plays his games. Jon is dead at Castle Black, stabbed by his own brothers. The family that once ruled the North from their seat at Winterfell has been shattered, scattered across the world, and Winterfell itself has been burned and occupied by enemies. It seems like the end of House Stark. But the Starks have endured worse. They survived the long night when the others came, and the sun hid its face for a generation. They survived 8,000 years of wars and winters, of plagues and famines and feuds. They have been brought low before, their numbers reduced to a handful, their castle threatened, their lands invaded, and always they have endured. The North remembers, people say, and the North is patient. The Starks are the blood of the first men, the children of winter, the family whose words are not a boast but a warning. Winter is coming, they say, and they have always been ready for it. The snows may bury them, the cold may bite deep, but when the thaw comes, the Starks are still there, rooted as deep as the weirwoods, enduring as the stones of Winterfell. The direwolves that came to the Stark children were a sign that something was changing in the world, that magic was returning and the old powers were waking. Direwolves had not been seen south of the wall for centuries, and suddenly 6 pups appeared for 6 children. The wolves were bound to their masters in ways that went beyond normal, and through them the Stark children touched something ancient and powerful. Some of the wolves are dead now. Lady killed on the King's Road, Greywind murdered at the Red Wedding. Others are lost. Nymeria runs wild in the Riverlands with a great pack at her back. Shaggy Dog is hidden on Skagos with Rickon. Summer remains with Bran beyond the wall, and Ghost with Jon at Castle Black. As long as the wolves live, something of the Stark children lives with them, a bond that death itself may not be able to break. The story of House Stark is not finished, not while any of them still breathe. Sansa has learned to play the Game of Thrones, and she has learned from the best and worst players in the realm. Arya has become a weapon, trained in ways of death that make her more dangerous than any knight. Bran has powers that let him see through time and space, abilities that could change the fate of the world. Rickon is young, but he is a true-born Stark, and there are those in the north who would rally to him. And Jon Snow may have died at Castle Black, but death is not always the end. Not in a world where magic is returning and red priests can bring men back from the grave. The Starks have been broken and scattered, but they have not been destroyed. They are still out there, and they still remember who they are. Winterfell will be rebuilt as it has been rebuilt before. The crypts will receive new statues, new swords, new Starks to rest in the darkness with their ancestors. Someday, perhaps, a Stark will sit again in the Great Hall, where the kings of Winter once held court, where Eddard Stark dispensed justice, where Robb Stark was proclaimed king. The wolves will return, and the old gods will watch from their weirwoods, and the words of House Stark will ring out across the north as they have for 8,000 years. Winter is coming, the Starks say, and it is a warning, but it is also a promise. No matter how dark and cold the winter becomes, the Starks will be there to meet it. They have always been there. They always will be. So rest now, and let the snow fall soft outside your window. Let the stories of the Starks settle into your mind like leaves drifting onto still water. They were lords and kings, warriors and builders, children and parents, and they lived and loved and lost across 8,000 years of history. They made mistakes and paid for them. They did their duty even when it destroyed them. They kept their honor even when it cost them everything. They were not perfect, but they were true, and in a world of liars and schemers, that truth shone like a blade in the darkness. The Starks are the North, and the North remembers. As you drift toward sleep, remember them too, these wolves of Winterfell, and know that somewhere in the cold and the dark, they endure. They always endure. Winter is coming, but so is the dawn.